Leo Kingston had spent his life closing deals, crushing competitors, and controlling every outcome. But none of his billions, none of his power, had prepared him for the moment a 6-year-old girl with dark curls and striking blue eyes tugged at his sleeve by the pool of his luxury hotel and whispered, "Please, mister, help me. My mom won't wake up." At first, he thought she had mistaken him for someone else. But as he followed her through the marble hallways, past the indulgent guests who had no idea their world was about to shift, Leo felt something unsettling crawl up his spine. And when he stepped into that dimly lit hotel room and saw the unconscious woman on the bed, his entire past came rushing back. Because he knew her. And the little girl clutching a battered stuffed rabbit? She had his eyes. Leo Kingston sat by the infinity pool of the exclusive hotel, his dark hair slightly tousled by the warm Monaco breeze. His glass of whiskey rested on the small side table next to him, untouched. The world around him was perfect: crystal clear water, waiters in crisp uniforms, and the quiet murmur of wealthy guests enjoying their private retreats. He had everything a man could ever want, yet an unfamiliar emptiness sat deep within his chest. He had spent years building his empire, turning his sharp instincts into a billion-dollar investment firm that controlled markets and toppled competitors. But success had come at a price. He had no real attachments, no family waiting for him anywhere, no one to share his achievements with. Relationships, when they happened, were transactional at best. His entire life was about control, of his business, his time, and his emotions. But for the first time in years, sitting under the golden afternoon sun, he felt like he had lost control of something, though he couldn't name what. As he exhaled slowly, letting his gaze drift over the edge of the pool, a small shadow moved in the corner of his vision. He turned his head slightly, expecting to see a waiter or perhaps one of the hotel staff, but instead, a little girl stood a few feet away from him. She had dark, curly hair that framed her delicate face, and her enormous blue eyes locked onto his with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. There was fear there, but also determination. In her small hands, she clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit, its fur faded from years of love. Leo frowned. Children weren't common in places like this, not without their wealthy parents hovering nearby. He scanned the area, expecting to see a nanny or a distracted mother on the phone, but the girl was alone. Something about her was strangely familiar, but he couldn't place it. Before he could say anything, she stepped closer, her little fingers tightening around the rabbit. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. "Sir, please, help me." Leo sat up, his instincts immediately sharpening. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved in other people's problems, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made it impossible to ignore. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice steady but softer than usual. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the hotel. "My mom, she won't wake up." For a moment, Leo didn't move. The words sank in, and a strange sensation gripped him, something between dread and protectiveness. He had dealt with high-stakes negotiations, ruthless corporate takeovers, and financial crises that made others crumble. But a little girl asking for help in a desperate whisper. That was entirely foreign to him. He stood up without thinking, already moving before his mind could question why. "Where is she?" The girl turned quickly and began to run toward the hotel. Leo followed without hesitation. Leo followed the little girl through the hotel's grand hallway, his polished shoes tapping against the marble floor as she hurried ahead, gripping her stuffed rabbit tightly. The guests around them barely took notice, sipping their champagne or lounging in luxury, oblivious to the urgency of the moment. The girl glanced over her shoulder once to make sure he was still there, then continued running down the corridor. Her small frame moved with surprising determination, as if she knew she had no time to waste. They reached an elevator, but instead of waiting, she turned and ran toward the stairs. Leo hesitated for only a second before following. She was moving quickly for someone with such short legs, her bare feet barely making a sound against the cool marble steps. He was used to moving fast, to making decisions in seconds that changed the course of industries, but there was something unnerving about following a frightened child up the winding staircase, unsure of what he was about to walk into. By the time they reached the third floor, she was slightly out of breath, but she didn't slow down. She ran straight to the end of the hallway, stopping in front of a door marked 312. The door was slightly ajar. Leo reached her just as she hesitated on the threshold, pressing her small body against the doorframe. She turned her head and looked up at him, her blue eyes wide with worry. For the first time, her confidence wavered. She clutched her rabbit closer and whispered, "She's inside." Leo gently pushed the door open, stepping into the dimly lit hotel room. The heavy curtains were drawn, casting long shadows across the bed. The air inside was thick, carrying the scent of salt from the nearby ocean mixed with something faintly medicinal. A bedside lamp was still on, its weak glow illuminating the still figure lying on the mattress. A young woman lay motionless on the bed, her dark hair fanned out against the pillow, her breathing barely visible. Her skin was pale, and the rise and fall of her chest was so faint that, for a terrible moment, Leo thought she might already be gone. He stepped closer, his sharp gaze scanning the scene. On the nightstand beside the bed, an open bottle of pills lay on its side, some of the tablets spilled onto the glass surface. His stomach tightened as realization struck him. He knelt beside the bed and carefully touched the woman's wrist, searching for a pulse. The beat was weak but still there. He exhaled, feeling an unexpected wave of relief. "She's alive," he said, more to himself than to the girl. The child had crept up beside him, staring at the woman with wide, unblinking eyes. She knelt on the floor next to the bed, placing her rabbit beside her mother's hand as if the toy could somehow bring her back. Leo pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. The call connected immediately, and he relayed the situation with his usual efficiency, giving the room number and explaining what he suspected, an overdose. The operator assured him an ambulance would arrive within minutes. As he ended the call, he turned to the girl, who had not moved from her spot. She was still staring at her mother, her tiny fingers wrapped around the woman's limp hand. "What's your name?" Leo asked gently. "Sophie," she murmured without looking at him. He glanced at the woman on the bed. He had no idea who she was or how she had ended up like this. But there was one thing he did know: Sophie had come to him for help. And for reasons he couldn't yet understand, he wasn't going to walk away. The paramedics arrived quickly, their movements efficient and precise as they assessed the unconscious woman on the bed. Leo stepped back, watching as they checked her vitals, inserted N4, and prepared her for transport. Sophie didn't move from her spot beside the bed, clutching her stuffed rabbit so tightly that her knuckles turned white. One of the paramedics, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, crouched down to Sophie's level. "Sweetheart, we're going to take your mom to the hospital so the doctors can help her, okay?" she said softly. Sophie didn't respond, just nodded once, her grip on the rabbit tightening. The paramedic glanced up at Leo, silently asking if he was with the girl. "I'll take her," Leo said without hesitation, though the words surprised even him. Sophie looked up at him for the first time since the paramedics arrived. Her blue eyes were full of uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure she could trust him yet. But something in her gaze told him she wanted to. The medics lifted her mother onto the stretcher, securing the straps before wheeling her out of the room. Leo followed, placing a steadying hand on Sophie's shoulder as they moved through the hallway, past the curious stares of hotel guests who had emerged from their rooms. By the time they reached the ambulance, Sophie hesitated, looking between the paramedics and Leo. "Can I go with her?" she asked, her voice small. The paramedic hesitated. "We usually only allow immediate family in the ambulance, sweetheart." Leo stepped forward. "She's just a child," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "She needs to be with her mother." The paramedic looked between him and Sophie, then sighed. "All right, she can ride up front." Leo watched as they helped Sophie into the passenger seat. He had no idea why he was still standing there, why he hadn't simply turned and walked away once the emergency was under control. But as the ambulance doors shut and the siren blared to life, he knew there was no way he was leaving this unfinished. He pulled out his phone, called his driver, and within minutes, his black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. He slid into the back seat and gave the driver the name of the hospital. As they drove, he found himself staring out the window, his mind racing. Something about this girl unsettled him. It wasn't just the situation, it was her. The way she had looked at him by the pool, the way she had chosen him to ask for help when there were dozens of other people around. And those eyes. They reminded him of something, or someone, but he couldn't quite place it. 15 minutes later, he arrived at the hospital. The waiting room was brightly lit, but it carried the heavy air of anxiety, filled with the soft murmurs of worried families and the beeping of distant machines. He spotted Sophie sitting in one of the chairs, her rabbit in her lap. Her small frame looked even smaller under the harsh fluorescent lights. He walked over and sat down next to her. She didn't look at him immediately, just kept staring at the rabbit in her hands. "They said she's sleeping," she whispered. "They don't know when she'll wake up." Leo nodded, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to comforting people. He dealt in numbers, logic, and control. This was completely out of his element. Sophie finally turned her head to look at him, studying him with those unsettlingly familiar blue eyes. "Why did you help us?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. He should have had a simple answer, because it was the right thing to do, because he had been the closest person around, because walking away wasn't an option when a child was involved. But none of those reasons felt entirely true. "I don't know," he admitted. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. "Do you know my mom?" she asked next. Leo opened his mouth, about to say no, but then something in his mind clicked. A memory, buried deep, trying to surface. A name, a face, a past he hadn't thought about in years. He turned his gaze toward the closed hospital doors where the doctors were treating Sophie's mother. And suddenly, he wasn't so sure of his answer anymore. Leo sat in the hospital waiting room, his mind a tangled mess of thoughts. He had spent years building a life of certainty, of calculated risks and strategic decisions, but nothing about this situation was predictable. He had come to this hotel to escape, if only for a few days, from the constant pressure of running a billion-dollar empire. And now, somehow, he found himself sitting beside a 6-year-old girl with eyes so eerily familiar that they made his stomach tighten. Sophie hadn't said much since they had arrived. She sat in the chair next to him, hugging her stuffed rabbit to her chest, her small fingers gripping its worn ears. Every now and then, she would steal a glance at him, as if trying to piece together why he was still here, why he hadn't simply left like any other stranger would have. Leo wasn't sure why either. A nurse finally emerged from the restricted area, her expression neutral but professional. She approached them, clipboard in hand. "Are you family?" she asked, looking at Leo. He hesitated. The answer was supposed to be no. He had no connection to this woman. Or at least, that was what he had thought. But now, with the weight of the little girl's eyes on him, with the sharp pull of something deep inside his chest, he wasn't sure of anything. He stopped himself. What was he even about to say? The nurse shifted her gaze to Sophie. "Your mom is stable, sweetheart. She's resting now, but she's very weak. We're going to keep her under observation for the next 24 hours. Sophie nodded but didn't say anything. She only clutched her rabbit tighter. Leo cleared his throat. "Can we see her?" The nurse hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "She's still unconscious, but you can sit with her." She gestured for them to follow. Leo placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, guiding her gently as they walked through the brightly lit corridor. The steady beeping of heart monitors filled the air, mingling with the muffled conversations of doctors and nurses moving between patients. They stopped at a small hospital room where a woman lay motionless on the bed. Her dark hair was fanned out on the pillow, her skin pale, her lips slightly parted as she breathed shallowly. Tubes ran from her arm, connected to an foredrip, and the faintest trace of dark circles shadowed her closed eyes. Sophie let go of Leo's hand and ran straight to the bedside. She placed her rabbit beside her mother's arm, as if that alone could bring her back. Leo stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat as he got a better look at the woman's face. Recognition hit him like a tidal wave. Emily. His mind reeled backward, pulling him into memories he had buried years ago. He remembered her. The soft laughter, the sharp wit, the way she used to challenge him in ways no one else ever dared to. He remembered the summer they spent together, the way she had looked at him like he was more than just the ruthless businessman the world saw. He remembered the fight, the heated argument that had ended everything. He remembered walking away. And now, she was lying in a hospital bed, barely holding on. Leo exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. His body tensed with the realization that made his pulse hammer against his ribs. Sophie wasn't just any child. She was his child. The blue eyes. The dark curls. The way she had unknowingly drawn him in, her presence pulling at something deep in his core. It all made sense now, but the weight of it was suffocating. Emily had never told him. She had kept this from him for 6 years. His hands curled into fists at his sides as he stared at the fragile woman in the bed, the mother of his child, the child he hadn't even known existed. Sophie turned to him then, her expression unreadable. "Did you know my mom before?" she asked softly. Leo's throat felt tight, the words catching before he could speak them. "Yes," he admitted, his voice quieter than he had expected. Sophie studied him for a long moment. Then she did something that completely shattered him. She reached out and took his hand in hers. It was small, warm, trusting. Leo swallowed hard, squeezing her fingers gently in return. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that no one could shake him. But in the span of one evening, a little girl with blue eyes had managed to break through every wall he had ever built. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what came next. Leo sat in the hospital chair, staring at Emily's unconscious face. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him like an anchor, and for the first time in years, he felt completely unprepared for what came next. His life had always been about control, about knowing every move before it happened, about being the one who dictated outcomes. But this was something he hadn't seen coming. Sophie sat beside him, still holding his hand, her small fingers curled around his much larger ones. She had no idea what he had just realized, no idea that the man she had randomly approached for help at the pool wasn't just a stranger. He was her father. Leo tried to process it, tried to wrap his mind around the fact that he had a daughter, that for 6 years, a piece of him had existed in the world without his knowledge. And Emily, she had kept this from him. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't demand answers from an unconscious woman, and he couldn't take out his frustration in front of Sophie. The little girl had already been through enough. "Does your mom talk about your dad?" he asked, keeping his voice as steady as possible. Sophie looked up at him with those striking blue eyes that now felt like a mirror of his own. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the rabbit in her lap. "No," she said quietly. "I used to ask when I was little, but she always changed the subject." Leo's chest ached at that. Had Emily resented him so much that she had erased him from their daughter's life completely? Or had she thought she was protecting Sophie from something? From him? He forced himself to take a slow breath. Getting angry wouldn't help anything. The only thing that mattered now was making sure Emily recovered, and making sure Sophie didn't feel alone in the process. "You said you used to ask," he said, watching her carefully. "Do you still wonder?" Sophie nodded, hugging the rabbit tighter. "Sometimes," she admitted. I used to make up stories about him. That maybe he was a pilot or a secret agent. That he had to go away on a mission but one day he'd come back. Leo felt something inside him crack. He had spent his entire life thinking he was too selfish, too ruthless, too focused on his ambitions to ever be a father. And yet, here was this little girl, his little girl, who had spent years hoping for a man she had never even met. Before he could respond, a soft groan came from the hospital bed. Sophie immediately turned, her face lighting up with relief. "Mom," she gasped, scrambling closer. Leo stood slowly, his body tensing as Emily's eyelids fluttered. She looked exhausted, her skin still pale, her movements sluggish as she tried to lift her head. Her eyes landed on Sophie first. She gave a weak smile and reached out, brushing her fingers over her daughter's cheek. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Sophie let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob. "I was so scared, Mommy." Emily's eyes softened, and she glanced around, as if only now realizing where she was. Then, her gaze moved past Sophie and landed on Leo. The second their eyes met, everything in the room shifted. A flicker of shock passed through her expression before something more complicated settled there. She blinked, as if convincing herself she wasn't seeing things, and then her body stiffened. Leo felt the tension instantly, but he didn't move. He just held her gaze, waiting for her to say something. Emily swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here?" Leo crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "Sophie found me," he said simply. "She asked me for help." Emily's eyes widened slightly, then flickered to Sophie, who was still clinging to the rabbit. She went to you." Emily's voice trembled slightly, and Leo didn't miss the unspoken meaning behind her words. Sophie had gone to him. Out of all the people in that hotel, she had chosen him. Emily's face paled even more as she seemed to realize something. Her lips parted slightly, and her fingers gripped the blanket covering her. Leo gave her a long, steady look before finally speaking the words that had been burning inside him since he first saw Sophie's eyes. "I know," he said quietly. "I know she's mine." Emily's breath hitched, her entire body going still. Silence filled the hospital room, heavy and suffocating. Leo had spent his entire life making powerful men uncomfortable, forcing them into corners with nothing but his presence. But this wasn't a negotiation or a business deal. This was something far more personal. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know if he had the upper hand. Emily lay frozen in the hospital bed, her breathing shallow as Leo's words settled in the air between them. Her fingers gripped the blanket tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. The beeping of the monitors filled the silence, but all Leo could focus on was the way her expression shifted, shock, hesitation, something close to fear. She had known this moment would come. That much was obvious. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. But there was no denying it now. Leo had spent his life in control of every situation, but for once, he had no idea what Emily would say next. Sophie sat beside her mother, watching the exchange carefully. She might have been young, but she was smart. Leo could tell she felt the weight of whatever was happening between them. Her small fingers clutched her stuffed rabbit as she shifted her gaze between them, confusion flickering across her face. Finally, Emily exhaled shakily, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you find out?" Leo narrowed his eyes slightly. "She has my eyes," he said simply. "The second I saw her, I knew something was off. But I didn't confirm it until I ran a DNA test." Emily flinched at that, her body tensing. "You did a test?" Leo didn't look away. "You didn't give me a choice." Her lips parted slightly, but she had no argument. They both knew she had kept the truth from him, and now there was no undoing it. A long silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Leo could feel the frustration building inside him, the questions he had been trying to push back now demanding answers. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his voice low, controlled. Emily looked away, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her hospital gown. "Because you made it clear you didn't want a family," she said quietly. "When I told you I was pregnant all those years ago, you acted like it was impossible, like it couldn't be real. You walked away, Leo." His jaw tightened. He remembered that night too well. They had fought, the argument escalating to the point of no return. He had been so consumed with his career, with his ambition, that the idea of a child had seemed like a disruption, something he hadn't planned for, something he hadn't wanted to believe. But that was 6 years ago. And now, everything was different. "You should have given me the chance to step up," he said, his voice sharp but not unkind. "You don't get to decide that for me." Emily let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "And what would you have done, Leo? Back then? You were so focused on your business, on proving yourself to the world. Do you really think you would have dropped everything to be a father?" Leo didn't answer right away. Because, deep down, he knew she was right. The man he had been back then wouldn't have been ready. He had been too cold, too selfish. But he wasn't that man anymore. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softer this time. "But you never gave me the chance to try." Emily looked at him then, her expression unreadable. There was hurt in her eyes, but there was something else, too, something almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether to believe him. Sophie shifted beside her mother, still hugging her rabbit. "Mommy?" she asked quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. Emily immediately softened, reaching out to tuck a curl behind her daughter's ear. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophie looked between them, then at Leo. "Is he my daddy?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that it hit Leo harder than he expected. He had spent years believing he wasn't built for family, that fatherhood wasn't something that fit into his life. But now, staring into the eyes of the little girl who had unknowingly changed everything, he realized how wrong he had been. Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing against Sophie's as she sighed. Then, finally, she nodded. "Yes, baby," she said softly. "He's your dad." Sophie blinked, as if trying to process the words. Then she looked at Leo again, her expression thoughtful. "Are you gonna stay?" she asked. Leo felt something shift inside him, something unfamiliar but undeniable. He had spent years chasing success, power, control. But in that moment, none of it mattered. There was only one answer he could give. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Emily's eyes flickered with something unreadable, but she didn't argue. She just looked down at Sophie, stroking her hair gently. Leo didn't know what the future looked like, but one thing was clear. For the first time in his life, he had something, someone worth fighting for. And he wasn't going to walk away again. Leo had always been a man who made decisions quickly and decisively. In business, there was no room for hesitation. He thrived on control, on knowing the next move before anyone else did. But as he sat in the hospital room, watching Emily's hesitant expression and the way Sophie looked at him with cautious curiosity, he realized this was the one situation where control didn't belong to him. Sophie had just learned the truth, and now she sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her small fingers tracing the seams of her stuffed rabbit. She didn't seem upset, just thoughtful, as if she were processing what it meant to have a father she had never known before. Emily, however, looked anything but calm. She was sitting up now, her back against the pillow, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the blanket draped over her legs. She kept glancing at Leo, and he could see the storm of emotions behind her eyes, uncertainty, guilt, maybe even regret. "You say you're staying," she finally said, her voice quieter than before. "But what does that even mean, Leo? You can't just walk in and expect everything to be fine." Leo met her gaze evenly. "I don't expect that," he said. "But I'm not leaving, either." Emily let out a soft, humorless laugh. "And what? You think you can just become her dad overnight?" Leo exhaled, forcing himself to remain calm. He understood why she was defensive. He had been absent from Sophie's life for 6 years, not by choice, but because of choices Emily had made for him. Now, he was here, and he wasn't going to let anyone, not even Emily, push him away. "I don't expect Sophie to trust me right away," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I don't expect you to either. But I'm not going to disappear just because this is complicated." Emily studied him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether he truly meant what he was saying. Sophie looked between them, then tilted her head slightly. "What happens now?" she asked. It was such a simple question, but neither of them had an easy answer. Leo leaned forward slightly, keeping his gaze on his daughter. "Now, we take things one step at a time," he said. "I get to know you. You get to know me. And we figure it out together." Sophie considered this, then looked up at her mother. "Is that okay, Mommy?" Emily hesitated before letting out a slow sigh. "If that's what you want, sweetheart," she said softly. Sophie nodded once, then looked back at Leo with an expression that was difficult to read. "Are you rich?" she asked suddenly. Leo blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected shift in conversation. Emily let out a surprised laugh, shaking her head. "Sophie," she said, amused despite the tension in the room. "What?" Sophie shrugged. "I just want to know." Leo smirked slightly. "Yeah," he admitted. "I am." Sophie considered this for a second, then nodded. "Okay." Emily rubbed a hand over her face. "That's it? That's your big question?" Sophie looked at her mother seriously. "If he's my dad, I need to know if he's good at stuff." Leo chuckled, unable to help himself. "I'd like to think I'm good at some things." Sophie seemed satisfied with that, then went back to hugging her rabbit. Emily sighed again, but this time it wasn't frustration, it was exhaustion. She leaned back against the pillow, closing her eyes for a moment. "I can't believe this is happening," she muttered. Leo studied her carefully. She looked pale, weaker than he liked. He didn't know how much she had been struggling before tonight, but he had a feeling it was more than she let on. "You should rest," he said. "I'll stay with Sophie." Emily opened her eyes, immediately looking wary. "Leo." He shook his head. "I'm not going to take her anywhere. I just want to be here." Emily stared at him for a moment, then finally, reluctantly, nodded. Sophie crawled up beside her mother, still holding her rabbit, and rested her head against Emily's arm. Within minutes, she was asleep. Leo sat back in the chair, watching them quietly. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about business or deals or power. He was thinking about them. And for the first time, he realized just how much he had to lose. Leo didn't leave the hospital that night. He stayed in the uncomfortable chair beside Emily's bed, watching as Sophie curled up next to her mother, her small hand still gripping the stuffed rabbit. Every now and then, Emily would stir, shifting slightly, but she never pushed Sophie away. The room was quiet, the only sounds coming from the steady beeping of the monitors and the occasional footsteps of nurses passing by in the hallway. Leo wasn't used to this kind of stillness. His world was made up of ringing phones, urgent emails, high-stakes meetings, and constant motion. But here, in this small hospital room, everything felt different. Slower. More real. He found himself studying Emily, the way her face softened in sleep, the way the lines of exhaustion on her forehead seemed deeper than they should have been. How long had she been carrying everything on her own? How many nights had she stayed awake, worrying about money, about Sophie, about how to give her daughter the life she deserved? The realization hit him with more force than he expected. While he had spent the last 6 years consumed by work, by profits and power, Emily had been raising their daughter alone. And she hadn't once come to him for help. Not for money. Not for support. Nothing. That truth didn't sit well with him. As the first hints of morning light began filtering through the blinds, Sophie stirred, her small body stretching before her blue eyes blinked open. She looked around, momentarily confused, before she spotted Leo sitting across from her. For a second, she just watched him, as if trying to decide whether or not he was really still there. Then, she sat up slightly and rubbed her eyes. "You stayed," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. Leo nodded. "I told you I would." She didn't say anything right away, just hugged her rabbit a little closer before looking at her mother, who was still asleep. Then, to Leo's surprise, she slid off the bed and walked over to him, standing just a few inches away. "Are you really my dad?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Leo looked down at her, at the dark curls that framed her face, at the striking blue eyes that mirrored his own. It was still strange, still something he was trying to process, but the answer was the easiest thing in the world. "Yes," he said. "I am." Sophie studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide if she believed him. Then, without warning, she reached out and touched the sleeve of his suit jacket, her small fingers brushing against the fabric. "You feel real," she said. Leo let out a quiet laugh, though there was something tight in his chest. "I am real," he promised. Sophie considered that, then nodded. "Okay." And just like that, it was as if something shifted between them. She didn't ask him any more questions, didn't press him for explanations he wasn't sure he even had yet. Instead, she simply climbed into the chair beside him, curling up with her rabbit in her lap. Leo sat there, staring at her, still trying to wrap his mind around the fact that this little girl was his daughter. He had spent so many years thinking he wasn't made for family, that he wasn't the kind of man who could ever be a father. But here she was. And for some reason, she didn't seem afraid of him. She trusted him. Emily stirred then, her eyelashes fluttering as she woke. The moment she opened her eyes, her gaze went straight to Sophie. A flicker of panic crossed her face for half a second before she realized her daughter was safe, sitting beside Leo. Her expression shifted into something more guarded. "You're still here." Leo met her gaze, unbothered by the skepticism in her voice. "I told you I'm not going anywhere." Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. She still looked tired, but there was something else there now, something hesitant. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I don't know how to let you be a part of her life." Leo leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then we figure it out," he said. "Together." Emily looked away for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the hospital blanket. "She doesn't even know you," she said. "She's only just met you." Leo nodded. "I know. But she came to me first, Emily. She trusted me before she even knew who I was. That has to mean something." Emily let out a slow breath, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I kept her from you," she admitted. "And I don't regret that, because back then, I didn't think you wanted to be a father. But now," she trailed off, her gaze flickering toward Sophie. Leo could see the struggle on her face, the fear of letting him in, the fear of what it might mean for Sophie. But he also saw something else, reluctant hope. He had spent years building walls around himself, convincing himself that relationships were distractions, that love was a weakness. But as he sat in that hospital room, watching his daughter quietly trust him in a way he didn't deserve, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. And for the first time in his life, Leo Kingston wanted something more than just success. He wanted to be a father. The morning sunlight cast a soft glow through the hospital room's window, illuminating the quiet scene inside. Emily sat upright in the hospital bed, her fingers absent-mindedly smoothing over the blanket as she watched Sophie, who was still curled up beside Leo in the chair. The little girl had fallen back asleep, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in her arms. Leo hadn't moved. He simply sat there, his posture relaxed, but his mind was anything but. His entire world had shifted in a matter of hours, and now he was left with a reality he had never even considered before. He had a daughter. A 6-year-old child who had spent her life believing her father was nothing more than a distant question, a mystery her mother never answered. Emily exhaled, drawing his attention back to her. He could see the hesitation in her expression, the uncertainty that hadn't left since she first realized he knew the truth. He understood it. She had raised Sophie alone, made every decision for her, and now, without warning, she had to figure out how to make space for him in a life he should have been part of all along. "I don't know how this is going to work," Emily admitted, her voice quiet, careful. "She's never had a father, Leo. She's never even asked for one since she was little." Leo studied her for a long moment before answering. "That doesn't mean she doesn't need one." Emily flinched slightly, as if his words struck something inside her, but she didn't argue. She glanced at Sophie, her face softening as she reached out to brush a stray curl away from her daughter's cheek. "I'm scared," she confessed. "Not just for her, but for me too." Leo leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "I get that," he said, his voice calmer than he felt. "But I need you to understand something, Emily. I'm not walking away from this. I missed 6 years of her life. I'm not missing another second." Emily looked at him then, really looked at him, as if searching for cracks in his determination. But there were none. He wasn't saying it just to say it. He meant every single word. After a long silence, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Okay," she said finally. "We take this slow. We figure it out as we go." Leo nodded, relief washing over him. "That's all I'm asking." Emily's lips pressed together, and she exhaled again, as if forcing herself to release years of fear and doubt. "She likes chocolate chip pancakes," she said after a moment. "It's the only breakfast she'll eat without complaining." Leo's eyebrows lifted slightly at the sudden change in conversation, but then he realized what she was doing. She was giving him something small, but important. A glimpse into their daughter's life. "Chocolate chip pancakes," he repeated, committing it to memory. Emily hesitated again, then continued. "She hates the sound of thunder. She always sleeps with that rabbit, even though it's old and falling apart. She loves coloring, but only with markers because she thinks crayons break too easily. And she hums when she concentrates, even though she doesn't realize she's doing it." Leo's chest tightened as he listened. Each detail felt like a window into the life he had missed, a life he should have been part of. "She's going to have questions," Emily said, her voice softer now. "She's going to want to know why you weren't there before." Leo's jaw tensed, because that was the one question he wasn't sure how to answer. How did he explain to a 6-year-old that he had been too blind to see the truth? That he had walked away from something he hadn't even known was real? "I'll tell her the truth," he said finally. "That I didn't know. That if I had, I never would have left." Emily held his gaze, searching for any sign of dishonesty. But there was none. After a long pause, she nodded. "Okay." Leo sat back, feeling something settle inside him. He had no idea what the future held, no idea how long it would take for Sophie to truly see him as her father. But he would wait. He would prove himself every single day, not just to her, but to Emily as well. Because for the first time in his life, he had something worth fighting for. And he wasn't going to lose it. This story is about more than just a billionaire discovering he has a daughter. It's about redemption, responsibility, and the unexpected ways life forces us to face the choices we once ran from. Leo Kingston starts as a man who believes he controls everything, his business, his reputation, his emotions. But finding Sophie shatters that illusion. She represents something he never accounted for, the chance to be part of something bigger than himself. The moment he realizes she's his daughter, his entire world shifts. Power and wealth no longer define him, fatherhood does. Emily, too, is a complex character. She's not just a woman who kept a secret, she's someone who made a difficult decision based on who Leo was at the time. She protected her daughter the only way she knew how. Her hesitance to let him in isn't just about anger, it's about fear. She's afraid of what letting him into Sophie's life might mean, afraid that he'll leave, that he'll break Sophie's heart the way he once broke hers. But the true heart of this story is Sophie. She's the one who instinctively reaches out to Leo before she even knows who he is. She is trusting, resilient, and full of innocent hope. And in the end, she's the reason both Leo and Emily take a chance on something uncertain. The final moments of the story aren't about a perfect, happy ending. Instead, they show the beginning of something real. Leo can't erase the past, but he can change the future. Emily can't undo her choices, but she can allow herself to believe that people can change. And Sophie, she gets what she's always quietly longed for, a father who chooses her. The beauty of this story lies in its imperfection. It's about learning to build something new from the wreckage of past mistakes. It's about forgiveness, second chances, and the realization that sometimes, the most unexpected people can change our lives forever. Alexander Rivers had spent his entire life believing he was alone. No family, no attachments, nothing to hold him back from building his empire. He had convinced himself that success was all that mattered, that there was nothing missing from his carefully constructed world. But all of that changed the moment a little girl with familiar blue eyes grabbed his sleeve in a hospital hallway and whispered, "Please, help my mom." He could have ignored it, could have walked away and continued living in the illusion that his past was buried. But then she said a name, Catherine Brooks, And in that instant, his entire world came crashing down. Alexander Rivers had spent years perfecting the art of control. As the CEO of one of the most successful hospitality empires in the country, he had built his career on discipline, precision, and an unwavering focus on success. He had no time for distractions, no patience for anything that didn't serve his long-term goals. He had structured his life in a way that left little room for anything personal, and he preferred it that way. Business was predictable. People were not. That afternoon, he found himself at the hospital, a place he rarely visited unless it was a necessity. One of his senior managers had been in a car accident, and although the injuries weren't life-threatening, Alexander felt obligated to check in. He wasn't sentimental, but he believed in loyalty. His employees were the backbone of his empire, and while he wasn't the kind of man to make small talk or send flowers, he made sure his people knew he had their back. He had just finished speaking with the doctor when he turned to leave, already calculating how much time he had lost from his schedule. That was when he heard the voice. "Please, help my mom." He stopped mid-step, turning toward the sound. A young girl stood a few feet away, looking up at him with wide, desperate blue eyes. She couldn't have been older than 10, her small frame tense as she clutched the fabric of her jacket with tiny fists. Her face was pale, her expression pleading. Alexander frowned. He wasn't used to children approaching him, especially not in a hospital. For a brief moment, he assumed she had mistaken him for someone else. But she wasn't looking around in confusion or searching for another adult. She was looking directly at him. "Who is your mother?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. The girl swallowed hard, her lips trembling slightly before she spoke. "Her name is Catherine Brooks." Everything around him seemed to pause. His breath hitched, his body stiffened, and for the first time in a long time, his mind went completely blank. That was a name he hadn't heard in over a decade. A name that belonged to someone he had once known well, someone he had once cared for more than he had admitted, even to himself. The weight of it hit him unexpectedly, pulling him back to a past he had long buried. His chest tightened as he forced himself to focus. It had to be a coincidence. There were plenty of women with that name. But something in the way this girl looked at him, something familiar, something unsettling, made him question everything. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice quieter now, laced with something even he couldn't define. The girl hesitated only for a second before she reached out, gripping his sleeve as if afraid he would disappear. "Please, you have to help her," she whispered. "She's really sick." Alexander felt a strange sensation settle over him, something between dread and urgency. He didn't know what he would find when he walked into that hospital room, but something told him that whatever it was, his life was about to change in ways he never could have anticipated. Without another word, he nodded and followed the girl down the hallway. As Alexander followed the girl down the stark white hospital hallway, he felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. He wasn't a man prone to emotion, nor was he someone who dwelled on the past, but hearing Catherine's name had shaken something loose inside him. He kept his steps measured, his face unreadable, but inside, questions swirled faster than he could process them. The girl, small but determined, walked ahead of him with a purpose that didn't belong to someone her age. She held onto his sleeve tightly, as if she was afraid he might disappear. There was something eerily familiar about her, the shape of her face, the way her lips pressed together when she was nervous, even the sharpness in her blue eyes. He had seen that expression before, but he couldn't yet place where. They reached a room near the end of the hallway, and the girl finally released his sleeve. She hesitated, her fingers lingering near the door handle before she turned to face him. "She doesn't know I went looking for help," she admitted, her voice quiet. "She doesn't like asking for things." Alexander clenched his jaw, recognizing that trait all too well. He gave her a short nod, then watched as she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The moment he entered the room, time seemed to slow. Catherine Brooks lay in the hospital bed, her once vibrant presence dimmed by exhaustion. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, her skin paler than he remembered, but even in her weakened state, she was still unmistakably her. She had barely changed, and yet, everything about the moment felt different. She looked fragile in a way he had never seen before. For a moment, he could do nothing but stare. Memories that had been locked away for years surged forward with an intensity he wasn't prepared for. Then, as if sensing his presence, Catherine slowly turned her head. Their eyes met, and the air in the room grew thick with everything unspoken between them. "Alex," she breathed, disbelief flickering across her face. His name on her lips sent an unexpected jolt through him. He had imagined running into her again under different circumstances, maybe in passing, maybe in another lifetime. But never like this. Never with a child, her child, standing between them, looking up at both of them with a mix of hope and uncertainty. He stepped forward, his voice controlled but laced with something unreadable. "What happened to you?" Catherine exhaled slowly, as if even speaking required effort. "Life happened." The girl, still standing at the side of the bed, placed a small hand on her mother's arm. "I brought someone to help, Mom," she said softly. "I brought him." Catherine's gaze flickered to her daughter before returning to Alexander. Something unreadable passed through her expression, shock, hesitation, regret. "I didn't expect to see you again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to be here," he replied. "But it seems a lot of things have happened that I wasn't aware of." Catherine's fingers curled slightly against the blanket, her body tense in a way that told him she was bracing herself. Alexander exhaled, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "Tell me the truth. What's going on?" Catherine hesitated, and for a moment, he thought she might refuse to answer. But then, she closed her eyes briefly before speaking. "I have a heart condition," she finally admitted. "It's gotten worse. The doctors say I need surgery, but you didn't tell anyone," Alexander finished, his voice sharper than he intended. Catherine looked away. It's not that simple. The frustration building inside him was hard to contain. He had spent years ensuring that people who worked for him, people who barely knew him, never had to go through hardships alone. And yet, the one person he had once loved had chosen to face this battle without anyone by her side. Before he could say anything else, the girl spoke up again. "Mom, I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I didn't want to lose you." Alexander turned to the child again, watching as she gripped the fabric of her mother's hospital gown, holding on as if she could keep her safe just by being close. Something in his chest tightened. Catherine's eyes softened as she reached out, brushing a hand through the girl's light brown hair. "Sophia, sweetheart, I told you not to worry." Sophia. Alexander's head snapped up at the name, realization crashing over him like a wave. He looked at Catherine, his voice quiet but demanding. "Who is she?" Catherine's hand stilled. Sophia turned her head slightly, confusion flickering in her blue eyes. "She's my daughter," Catherine answered carefully. The air felt like it had been sucked from the room. He swallowed hard, his mind racing, piecing together what should have been obvious the moment he walked in. He turned back to Sophia, studying her with a new understanding. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally spoke. "She's my daughter, isn't she?" Catherine didn't answer right away. Her lips parted, but no words came. Then, finally, she gave the smallest nod. "Yes, Alex," she admitted. "She's yours." Alexander felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. His mind struggled to keep up with what he had just heard. The girl standing between him and Catherine, this small, frightened child, was his daughter. The weight of that truth hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over years of certainty and leaving him drowning in a sea of questions. He turned to look at Sophia again, really looked at her this time. The resemblance was undeniable. Her blue eyes, the shape of her face, even the way she carried herself with a quiet kind of determination, these were things he had seen in himself for years. How had he not realized it the moment he walked into the room? His throat felt tight as he turned back to Catherine, his voice coming out lower than he intended. "How long have you kept this from me?" Catherine's fingers tensed against the blanket, guilt flickering across her face. "I never planned to," she admitted. I was scared. By the time I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone. You were building your empire, making something of yourself, and she stopped, exhaling shakily. "I didn't want to hold you back, Alex." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His entire life had been built around control, around making decisions that shaped his future, yet here he was, learning that one of the most important choices had been taken from him without his knowledge. "You should have told me," he said, his voice rougher than before. "You had no right to make that decision for me." Catherine flinched, but she didn't look away. "I know," she whispered. "But back then, I thought I was doing the right thing. You were on the edge of something great, and I told myself that if I reached out, it would only complicate things for you." Anger, hurt, and something far more complicated churned inside him. "So you decided I didn't need to know?" "I decided that I didn't want Sophia to grow up thinking she was someone's mistake," Catherine said, her voice suddenly sharper. "I knew you, Alex. I knew that if I told you, you would have dropped everything. And I didn't want to be the reason you resented us." Alexander clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. He wanted to argue, to tell her she had been wrong, but a part of him, the part that had spent years prioritizing business over everything else, knew there was some truth in her words. He had been ruthless in his pursuit of success. If he had known back then, would he have been the father Sophia needed? The thought made his stomach turn. He looked at Sophia again. She was watching them both carefully, her small hands gripping the edge of her mother's blanket. She was old enough to understand that something big was happening, but young enough that the full weight of it hadn't settled on her yet. "I'm sorry," Catherine said, her voice quieter now. I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know how to do it differently. Alexander exhaled slowly, trying to push past the storm raging inside him. Does she know? Catherine hesitated before shaking her head. She knows about you. She knows your name, that you're successful, that I once cared about you. But she never knew the full truth. Not until now. Alexander nodded stiffly, turning back to Sophia. His heart pounded in his chest as he knelt down to her level, suddenly feeling like a stranger in his own life. Sophia, he said gently. Do you understand what we're talking about? The girl hesitated, glancing at her mother before looking back at him. You're my dad, she said softly, as if testing the words. Alexander's breath caught. Hearing it aloud made it more real than anything else had. He swallowed past the lump in his throat, forcing himself to hold her gaze. Yes, he said. I am. Sophia studied him, her expression unreadable. Are you staying? The simplicity of the question nearly broke him. He had spent years making promises to business partners, investors, and shareholders, but never to someone who truly needed him. This was different. This mattered in a way he had never experienced before. He didn't hesitate. Yes, he said firmly. I'm staying. Sophia's eyes flickered with something uncertain, but then, slowly, she nodded. Catherine watched them both, her expression unreadable. What happens now? She asked. Alexander didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to walk away. We figure it out, he said. Together. Alexander had spent years mastering control, but sitting in Catherine's hospital room with the weight of everything he had just learned, he felt like he was grasping at something just out of reach. The world he had built, the life he had carefully structured, had changed in an instant. He had a daughter. An entire decade of her life had passed without him even knowing she existed. The realization was overwhelming, but there was no time to dwell on his emotions. Right now, there were bigger concerns. Catherine was still too weak to sit up for long, and Sophia had curled up in the chair beside her, exhaustion settling in after the emotional weight of the conversation. Alexander remained standing, hands in his pockets, his mind moving a mile a minute. The business side of him had already switched into problem-solving mode, assessing what needed to be done. Catherine needed proper medical care, and if the doctors were saying surgery was necessary, he wasn't going to waste another second. What's the next step? He asked, his voice even but firm. Catherine blinked at him, as if not expecting the question. What do you mean? For your treatment, he clarified. I assume there's a plan. She exhaled, her gaze dropping to her hands. The doctors want to schedule surgery within the next few weeks, but I was waiting on approval. I don't have the best insurance, and I've already used most of my savings on treatments to manage the symptoms. Alexander's jaw tightened. The thought of her struggling through this alone, worrying about finances on top of everything else, sent a sharp wave of frustration through him. That's not a concern anymore, he said, pulling his phone from his pocket. You're getting the best care available. I'll handle the costs. Catherine tensed, her expression immediately shifting into one of resistance. Alex, no. I didn't tell you about Sophia to ask for money. He looked at her sharply. I don't care why you told me. The fact is, I know now. And I'm not going to stand by while you risk your life because you're too proud to accept help. She looked torn, glancing at Sophia as if she didn't want to have this argument in front of her. Alexander followed her gaze, noticing how peaceful the little girl looked despite the tension in the room. He lowered his voice, stepping closer to Catherine. I know you're used to handling everything on your own, he said. But you don't have to anymore. Whether you like it or not, I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. She searched his face, something unreadable in her expression. For a moment, it looked like she wanted to fight him on this, to insist she could manage on her own. But then, slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased. "Fine," she murmured. "But only if you let me pay you back when I can." Alexander let out a slow breath, knowing this was the best compromise he was going to get. "Deal." Catherine looked down at Sophia again, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "She's been so strong through all of this," she said softly. "Too strong for her age." Alexander studied his daughter, the word still foreign in his mind. He had spent years closing himself off from attachments, convincing himself that he was better off alone. But seeing Sophia now, knowing she had been out there all this time, changed something inside him. "She shouldn't have had to be," he admitted. "That's going to change." Catherine sighed, leaning her head back against the pillow. "She'll need time, Alex. You can't just step in and expect everything to fall into place overnight." "I don't," he said. "But I can't ignore the fact that I've already missed too much time. I need to figure out how to make up for it." Catherine smiled faintly, exhaustion creeping into her features. "You're already doing more than I ever expected." He didn't know how to respond to that. Part of him was still grappling with the fact that he had been left out of Sophia's life for so long, but another part of him understood. He had been a different man back then, driven only by ambition. Would he have been ready for fatherhood if Catherine had told him? He wasn't sure. But he was sure of one thing now. He wasn't going to miss another moment. As the room settled into silence, he pulled out his phone and made a few calls. By morning, the best doctors in the state would be reviewing Catherine's case, and arrangements would be made for the surgery. He had spent his life building a legacy through business, but none of it had ever felt as important as what he was doing now. He had always believed success was measured in power and achievement. But for the first time, he was starting to realize it was measured in something much greater. The following days passed in a blur of phone calls, medical appointments, and logistical arrangements. Alexander had wasted no time in pulling every string necessary to ensure Catherine received the best care possible. Within hours of making his first call, her case had been assigned to one of the top surgeons in the state. The operation was scheduled for the following week, and he had personally ensured that every aspect of her hospital stay would be covered, regardless of cost. Despite her initial resistance, Catherine had eventually relented, though he could see the struggle in her eyes every time another plan was put into place. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, and it was clear that the idea of accepting help, especially from him, was difficult. But she also knew she didn't have the luxury of refusing. Sophia needed her, and for that reason alone, she let him take control. Alexander had never been one to linger in hospitals, but now he found himself spending more time there than anywhere else. Every evening, after work, he stopped by to check on Catherine and spend time with Sophia. The first few visits had been awkward. Sophia, despite her initial desperation to help her mother, wasn't entirely sure how to act around him now that she knew who he was. She was polite, but cautious, as if unsure whether he was really going to stay. It frustrated him, not because he expected immediate acceptance, but because he knew that was a result of the years he had missed. He had always prided himself on being a man who could fix any situation, but this was different. This wasn't a business deal he could negotiate or a problem he could solve overnight. This was a relationship, fragile and uncertain, and for once, he had to learn patience. One evening, he arrived at the hospital later than usual. Meetings had run longer than expected, and by the time he made it to Catherine's room, she was already asleep. Sophia was curled up in the chair beside her bed, a book resting on her lap. She looked up as he entered, watching him carefully. "You're late today," she said, not accusingly, just stating a fact. Alexander nodded, stepping further into the room. "I had some work to finish. But I told you I'd be here, didn't I?" Sophia considered that for a moment before nodding. "Yeah. You did." He glanced at the book in her hands. "What are you reading?" She hesitated for a second before holding it up so he could see the cover. It's a mystery book. Mom got it for me a while ago. Alexander pulled a chair closer and sat down. Do you like mysteries? Sophia shrugged. Sometimes. I like trying to figure things out before the book tells you the answer. He smirked slightly. That's a good skill to have. Knowing how to see the ending before it happens. She looked at him thoughtfully. Is that how you got rich? Alexander wasn't expecting the question, but he wasn't surprised by it either. Sophia was observant. She had probably heard things about him over the years, had likely formed her own opinions long before they ever met. Part of it, he admitted. I learned how to predict things, how to stay ahead. But sometimes, the best things in life aren't the ones you plan for. Sophia was silent for a moment, flipping the corner of a page absent-mindedly. You didn't plan for me, she finally said, her voice quieter than before. The words hit him harder than he expected. He exhaled slowly, leaning forward slightly. No, he said honestly. I didn't. But that doesn't mean I don't want to be here now. Sophia looked down at her book, her fingers tracing over the worn edges of the cover. I guess I just don't know what this means yet, she admitted. Alexander nodded, understanding. That's okay. We'll figure it out. She studied him for a long moment, then slowly, she shifted in her chair, sitting up straighter. Do you want me to tell you what the book is about? Something in his chest eased at the question. I'd like that. Sophia nodded, opening the book again. Okay. So, there's this detective, and he gets a case that seems simple at first, but then. As she started explaining the plot, Alexander listened, watching the way her face lit up as she spoke. It was a small thing, but it felt like a step forward. And for the first time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, he still had a chance to be the father she deserved. The morning of Catherine's surgery arrived sooner than Alexander had expected. He had spent the past week ensuring that every possible precaution had been taken, that the best surgeons were on her case, and that Sophia would be taken care of no matter what happened. But despite all his planning, despite his relentless need for control, there was one thing he couldn't change, the uncertainty that came with waiting. He arrived at the hospital before dawn, stepping into Catherine's room just as the nurses were preparing her for the procedure. She looked up at him with tired eyes, but there was something softer in her expression than there had been before. Over the past week, she had slowly begun to accept his presence, no longer treating his involvement as something temporary. You're here early, she murmured, her voice slightly hoarse. I wasn't going to let you go into this alone, he said, moving closer to the bed. Sophia's still asleep. I made sure she was comfortable before I came in. Catherine exhaled, her lips curving into a faint smile. She told me you stayed late last night. She likes having you around. Alexander wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had spent years avoiding any kind of emotional entanglement, but hearing that Sophia had grown comfortable with him did something unexpected to his chest. She's a good kid, he finally said. Strong. Just like you. Catherine's gaze softened. She's had to be. There was a weight behind those words that he didn't miss. He had only known Sophia for a short time, but he had already seen glimpses of the burden she carried. She had grown up without a father, watching her mother struggle in silence, and yet she had been the one to take action when things got worse. That kind of strength wasn't something a child should have to develop so young. Alexander sat down in the chair beside the bed, his fingers lacing together as he looked at her. No more doing this alone, he said firmly. That ends today. Catherine let out a breath, something unspoken passing between them. I still don't know what this looks like, Alex. Us. You, me, and Sophia. We don't have to know everything right now, he said. But I do know one thing. I'm not walking away. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. Okay. A nurse entered then, interrupting the moment. "Ms. Brooks, it's time to take you down to pre-op." Catherine glanced at Alexander once more before shifting to sit up. He instinctively reached out, steadying her when she wobbled slightly. The touch was brief but grounding, a reminder of the history they shared. As the nurses helped her onto the stretcher, she looked up at him. "Take care of her while I'm in there." "You don't even have to ask," he said. She nodded, then allowed the nurses to wheel her out of the room. Alexander stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where she had been, then took a deep breath before turning to leave. When he reached the waiting room, Sophia was already there, sitting in one of the chairs with her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up as he approached, her blue eyes filled with unspoken worry. "Is she gone?" she asked. "They just took her in," he said, lowering himself into the chair beside her. Sophia stared down at the floor, fidgeting with the hem of her sweatshirt. "She said she'd be okay, but, what if something goes wrong?" Alexander wasn't used to comforting people. He had spent his entire life focused on results, on logic, on numbers, and business deals. But this wasn't something he could fix with money or power. This was his daughter, and she was scared. He reached out, resting a steady hand on her shoulder. "She's in good hands. The best doctors are with her. And no matter what happens, we'll get through it. Together." Sophia looked up at him, searching his face for something. After a moment, she exhaled and nodded. "Okay." They sat there in silence for a while, the hospital's fluorescent lights casting a dull glow over the room. For the first time in a long time, Alexander found himself in a situation where he wasn't in control. And yet, as he sat beside his daughter, waiting for news of Catherine, he realized something. Maybe some things weren't meant to be controlled. Maybe some things were just meant to be felt. The waiting felt endless. Time stretched in a way Alexander wasn't used to, every minute ticking by slower than the last. He had spent years making quick decisions, calculating outcomes, and controlling every variable in his life. But here, in this sterile waiting room, there was nothing to control. The fate of someone who had once meant everything to him, someone who still did, was out of his hands. Sophia sat beside him, silent but tense. She hadn't spoken much since Catherine had been taken into surgery, and Alexander hadn't pushed her. He could tell she was trying to hold herself together, but every so often, she would shift in her chair, hugging her knees tighter or playing with the sleeves of her sweatshirt, clear signs of the nerve she was trying to suppress. A nurse walked by, and Sophia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with anticipation, but the woman kept moving. He could see the flicker of disappointment cross her face before she quickly masked it. "She's going to be okay," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Sophia didn't look at him right away. Instead, she stared down at her sneakers, kicking them lightly against the chair's leg. "You don't know that," she murmured. Alexander exhaled. "No, I don't. But I do know that she's strong. And she has people fighting for her." Sophia glanced up at him then, studying him like she was still trying to figure him out. "Did you ever think about her after you left?" The question caught him off guard, though maybe it shouldn't have. He shifted slightly, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I did," he admitted. "More than I let myself say out loud. There were times I thought about reaching out, but I convinced myself she had moved on. That she didn't need me anymore." Sophia frowned. "She never stopped needing you," she said, and there was no anger in her voice, just quiet sadness. "She just didn't want to get in your way." The weight of that truth settled over him, heavier than he expected. Catherine had always been independent, but he hadn't realized just how much she had sacrificed for his sake. "I should have been there," he said after a long pause. Sophia hesitated, then sighed. "You're here now," she said, as if that was enough for the moment. Alexander glanced at her again, seeing a depth in her that went beyond her years. She had been forced to grow up faster than she should have, carrying responsibilities no child should have to bear. And now, in the middle of this uncertainty, she was showing more resilience than some adults he knew. "You remind me of her," he said, and for the first time, he saw the hint of a smile tug at the corner of her lips. Before either of them could say anything else, the door to the surgical wing opened, and a doctor stepped out. Sophia shot to her feet, and Alexander followed, his heart pounding in a way that was entirely unfamiliar to him. The doctor gave them a reassuring nod before speaking. "The surgery was successful. Catherine is stable, and she's being moved to recovery now. She'll be groggy for a while, but everything went as planned." Sophia let out a shaky breath, her shoulders visibly relaxing. "Can we see her?" The doctor hesitated. "She needs some time to wake up fully, but one of you can go in first. Just for a few minutes." Sophia immediately turned to Alexander, her expression determined. "You go." He blinked at her, momentarily thrown off. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Yeah. I'll go in after." For a moment, he could only stare at her, surprised by how selfless she was, by how much she had already learned to put others before herself. He gave her a small nod before turning to follow the doctor down the hall. The beeping of the monitors was the first thing he noticed when he stepped into the room. Catherine looked fragile, paler than he had ever seen her, but she was breathing steadily. He moved closer, hesitating for a moment before sitting down in the chair beside her bed. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but he spoke anyway. "You scared the hell out of me," he murmured. "But you made it through." Her eyelashes fluttered slightly, and after a moment, her eyes opened just enough to see him. "Alex?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "I'm here," he said, leaning forward. "Everything went well. The doctor said you'll be okay." She gave him a weak smile, her hand twitching slightly against the sheets. Without thinking, he reached out, covering her fingers with his own. "You stayed," she murmured. He tightened his grip slightly. "Of course, I did." She let out a slow breath, her eyes drifting closed again, but the faintest smile remained on her lips. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt something shift inside him, something real, something that had nothing to do with business or power. Something that felt like home. Catherine's recovery was slow but steady. The doctors were optimistic about her progress, and within a few days, she was able to sit up and hold longer conversations without struggling for breath. Alexander had made sure she had everything she needed, from private nurses to round-the-clock care, and he didn't leave the hospital unless it was absolutely necessary. Sophia had been her mother's constant companion, but she had also started to warm up to Alexander in ways he hadn't expected. At first, their conversations had been brief and careful, as if she was still trying to decide if she could trust him. But over time, she had started to talk to him more, ask him questions, and even include him in small moments that had once belonged only to her and Catherine. One afternoon, Alexander arrived at the hospital to find Sophia sitting beside her mother's bed, quietly reading aloud from a book. Catherine was half awake, listening with a small smile, and when she noticed Alexander standing in the doorway, she gave him a tired but warm look. "You're just in time for the best part," Catherine murmured. Sophia glanced up at him, then hesitated before holding the book out. "Do you want to read the next page?" The offer caught him off guard, but he took the book without hesitation and settled into the chair beside Catherine's bed. Sophia scooted over to make room for him, watching as he found the place where she had left off. He wasn't used to this, wasn't used to soft moments or quiet gestures, but he wanted to learn. As he read aloud, he could feel both Catherine and Sophia relaxing beside him. The hospital room, which had once felt cold and clinical, now felt almost warm, filled with something he hadn't realized he was missing. Later that evening, when Catherine had drifted off to sleep, Alexander found himself outside the hospital with Sophia, who had insisted on getting some fresh air. They sat on a bench near the entrance, the cool evening breeze wrapping around them. Sophia kicked at a pebble on the ground, her expression thoughtful. You know, I used to make up stories about you, she said after a moment. Alexander turned to look at her, surprised. What kind of stories? She shrugged. Sometimes you were a secret agent. Sometimes a famous explorer. Once, I even imagined you were a prince who had to go on a mission to save a kingdom. He smirked. I think I like the explorer version best. Sophia gave a small smile, then looked down at her hands. I used to wonder why you weren't here. But now, I think I get it. Mom said you were building something important, and I guess I understand why she didn't tell you. Alexander exhaled, leaning forward slightly. I wish she had. Sophia nodded. Me too. He hesitated, then looked at her seriously. But I need you to know something. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any sign that he might change his mind. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said. It was a simple word, but to Alexander, it meant everything. A week later, Catherine was discharged from the hospital. She was still weak, still in need of rest, but she was finally able to go home. Alexander had made arrangements for her to recover somewhere comfortable, a quiet estate outside the city where she wouldn't have to worry about anything. At first, she had protested, insisting she didn't want to be a burden, but he had shut that argument down immediately. You're not a burden, he had told her. You never were. Now, as he helped her settle onto the couch in the sunlit living room of the house, she sighed in contentment. Sophia curled up beside her, and for the first time in a long time, they both looked at peace. Catherine glanced at Alexander, her expression unreadable. You really did all of this? He nodded. Of course. She smiled softly. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, he said simply. Just focus on getting better. She studied him for a long moment, then reached out, resting her hand over his. It was a small gesture, but it held years of unspoken words, of things they had never said. Sophia, watching the exchange, finally spoke up. So, what happens now? Alexander looked at her, then at Catherine, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to have a perfectly planned answer. Now, he said, we figure it out. Together. Catherine smiled, and Sophia gave a small nod, as if deciding she was okay with that answer. And as Alexander sat there, surrounded by the family he never knew he had, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about the future or the past. He was just here, in this moment, exactly where he was meant to be. The ending of this story is powerful not because it ties everything up neatly with a perfect resolution, but because it embraces the reality of rebuilding relationships. Alexander Rivers starts as a man who believes he has everything, power, wealth, and control, but through the unexpected revelation of his daughter and the return of Catherine, he realizes that true success isn't measured by what he has built, but by the people he chooses to hold close. What makes the conclusion so satisfying is that it doesn't rush the emotional journey. Alexander doesn't suddenly become the perfect father overnight, nor does Sophia immediately trust him without hesitation. There is still uncertainty, still wounds that need healing, but the key difference is that they're no longer facing it alone. The story acknowledges that repairing lost time isn't about grand gestures, but about showing up, proving through actions rather than words that he is here to stay. Catherine's acceptance of his help is another significant moment. She spent years believing she had to handle everything on her own, afraid that asking for support would be seen as a weakness. But by the end, she allows herself to lean on Alexander, not because she has no other choice, but because she finally sees that he's sincere. Her quiet strength, combined with her willingness to let him in, makes their reunion feel authentic rather than forced. Sophia, as the heart of this story, represents both the pain of lost time and the hope of second chances. Her cautious approach to Alexander is entirely realistic. She doesn't fully trust him at first, and why would she? He's a stranger who was absent for most of her life. But the moment she starts opening up, sharing small moments with him, it's clear that she wants to believe in him. And when she finally accepts him as her father, it's not because he's promised her the world, but because he's proven he's not going to walk away. The most beautiful part of this ending is that it doesn't rely on dramatic declarations or forced resolutions. Instead, it focuses on the simple but profound truth that family isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to be there, to fight for one another, to show up even when things aren't easy. Alexander doesn't just gain a daughter, he gains a new purpose, a reason to redefine what matters most. The final scene, where he admits he doesn't have all the answers but is willing to figure it out together, is the perfect way to close this chapter of his life. It acknowledges the uncertainty of the future while reinforcing the one thing that truly matters: he is no longer facing it alone. And that, more than anything, is what makes this story not just moving, but deeply meaningful.